All right, learning objective 3, discuss the development of propaganda and the suspension of civil liberties during the war. Um, so in this we're going to look at a guy named George Creel, who was in charge of basically the propaganda war machine to get the United States excited and in support of the war. We will look briefly at opposition to the European War, World War One. We'll look at George Creel's committee, which was the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, and some of the components of the CPI, which is the Four Minutemen, some of the films that were made, the Division of Pictorial Publicity. And then finally we'll look at dissent and suppression of civil liberties during the war. So first off, propaganda, what is it? Well, it's a form of communication aimed towards influencing the attitude of the community towards some cause or position by presenting only one side of an argument. Propaganda statements can be partially false. They could be partially true. Propaganda is usually repeated and dispersed over a wide variety of media in order to create the chosen result in audience attitudes. So as opposed to impartially providing information, propaganda, its most basic sense, presents information primarily to influence an audience. Propaganda often presents facts selectively, thus by possibly lying by omission, to encourage a particular synthesis, or uses loaded messages to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information presented. The desired result is a change of attitude toward the subject in the target audience for further political, religious, and even more so commercial agendas. Propaganda can be used as a form of ideological or commercial warfare. So in many ways, propaganda, although it has a negative connotation, really it is really a neutral thing. It's just part of the world in which we live in. And the way to see it as a neutral element within our media frenzy society is just to recognize it when you see it, which is sometimes harder said than done, but because sometimes it's when you agree with a certain message, it doesn't appear to be propaganda, it appears to be impartial. But in many ways, a lot of the things that we're inundated with is propaganda. And certainly during the war, propaganda was incredibly useful to getting people on board with the war. So examples of some observations about propaganda. The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over again. Joseph Goebbels, 1933. This was the guy in charge of the propaganda machine for the Nazis during World War II. Propaganda must not serve the truth, especially insofar as it might bring something favorable for its opponent. Adolf Hitler, 1924. Today, the world is the victim of propaganda because people are not intellectually competent. More than anything, the United States needs effective citizens competent to do their own thinking. William Mather Lewis, 2001. See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda. George W. Bush, 2005. Right, so George W. Bush understood the power of propaganda, just like any political leader. Any president, any prime minister, any king, any dictator must understand the power of propaganda if they are wanting to enact their policies in an effective manner. So for Wilson, President Wilson, he narrowly won the war, won his second term, and one of the reasons why he was able to win his second term is that he promised to keep the American people out of the European conflict. But as conditions worsened in Europe and things began to look like America was being drawn in, he now had a very serious political problem. Just to give you a sense of how much Americans wanted to stay out of this war, because they kind of suspected that America would be drawn into it. But by 1917, 40 different peace groups were active within the United States. And they were active for the sole purpose of keeping the United States out of the war. Wellington House reported to London that apathy toward the war was pervasive. Wellington House is the propaganda arm was the propaganda arm of Great Britain, and they were quite worried because it looked like the United States would not be able to get into this war. So President Wilson tapped the shoulder of a well-known journalist at the time, this guy named George Creel. George Creel would run the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, and he asked, basically, in response to this charge of creating basically war fervor and support for the war, this is a quote of his that articulates what he believed what was very important. How could the national emergency be met without national unity? The printed word, the spoken word, motion pictures, the telegraph, the wireless, cables, posters, signboards, and every possible media should be used to drive home the justice of Americans. So he was a long-time journalist, George Creel. He worked for Kansas City World. He started his own newspaper in Kansas City in 1899. He also wrote for the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News. So the Committee on Public Information was ran by 3 cabinet members and Chairman Creel. They met only once, and George Creel never met with them again. He micromanaged the whole thing. The Committee on Public Information was George Creel. George Creel was the Committee on Public Information. So their first charge was to make sure that they had enough men to sign up for the first registry of the draft, June 5th, 1917. And this was a huge task. The last time there was a significant draft was during the Civil War, and there were still older people living at a time that had living memories of the draft riots, especially in New York City, dealing with the Civil War. Senator Reed warned Secretary of War Newton Baker that the streets of America would run red with blood on registration day. Also, keep in mind, because of the experience with the Filipino-American War, that war was seen very much as an unnecessary war, and created really a kind of a peace movement with the United States, that the United States really shouldn't get involved in any aspect of the world unless it was existentially endangered. So the draft was the first order of business for George Creel for the CPI. So again, their first topic, universal service by selective draft, right? Get people to register for the draft. So from May 21st to 12th to the 21st, there were 75,000 speeches through a program called the 4-Minute Men. And what the 4-Minute Men were was this really phenomenal program that George Creel put together. He tapped the shoulders of basically community leaders all over the country, inducted them into this. And they would give these really fiery, patriotic speeches about the duty of Americans and the duty America had to preserving democracy in the world. And so it would be ministers, business leaders, labor union leaders, all sorts of individuals would give these speeches. And mainly they would give these speeches in this fast-growing medium called the movie theater, where people were going, right? You go where the people are is the first order of any propagandist. And they gave these speeches within a short amount of time, 75,000 speeches all over the country. It cost the government about $101,000. In today's money, it would be $1.7 million. A drop in the bucket as far as government spending is concerned. And it worked. By June 5th of 1917, 10 million men signed up. And this gave the United States 516,000 eligible draftees, which was a major deal. Right now, today we're used to having a ready armed military force But this is a recent phenomena in American history since World War II. Traditionally, what would happen after a war, the American military would scale down completely. This is a tradition that goes all the way back to George Washington. Um, and this would remain so until after World War II, which we'll talk about when we get to the Cold War. But this was an imperative. The United States was going to fight this war, that we would get as many able-bodied men to fight this war in order to be victorious. Creel also got into the movie business. His filmmaking producers feature such films as Pershing's Crusaders and Under Four Flags. These remain known as classics for their time. Creel's films earned the committee $852,000 roughly, which would be about 15 million bucks today. So not too many government programs actually churn a profit. Probably one of the most successful aspects of the CPI was the division of pictorial publicity. He tapped the shoulder of a well-known illustrator named Charles Dana Gibson, and they recruited about 1,400 works of art, which were reproduced by the millions. The most famous was done by James Montgomery Flagg. What do you think it was? I guarantee you've seen this thousands of times. Which is a testament to the power of this image, no matter if you're sort of immune to its amazing features. But here's the image. I want you, right? There's Uncle Sam pointing the finger right at you. If you don't do what he says, this guy is going to seriously kick your butt, right? An incredibly powerful image, which its success and power still resonates to this very second. Here's some other examples of propaganda, including this one right here. But Uncle Sam, he's the man. So Uncle Sam's pulling up his sleeves. He got an eagle by his shoulder over there. He's taking off his jacket and his hat, and he's ready to fight, right? A lot of the CPI worked towards raising money for the war. There were lots of bonds and trading stamps even to raise money for this war. The little soldier... you can help Big Brother by buying thrift stamps. Fill your card. A lot of pictures were aimed at the insecurities of male masculinity. Gee, if I were a man, I'd join the Navy, right? That's kind of a thing. Even Grandma's in on the action. Grandma buys Liberty bonds. All right, so a lot of really great propaganda shticks were produced during this war, and it was necessary. It's necessary for any war if it's going to be fought. One of the worst things that can happen is a country goes into war without the backing of the American people. We saw this as the war progressed in Vietnam, and we also saw this as the war progressed in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's important not only to get the people involved and in support of the war when the war begins, but it's also necessary to keep people supporting the war as the war continues, if it's going to be a depoliticized war in the home front. But despite the great propaganda, and it was very effective, but there were still many citizens who opposed the war. And so it was deemed necessary, for right or wrong, to enact very restrictive laws. And the two main laws that would dissuade opposition to the war were the Espionage and the Sedition Acts. And definitely many outspoken people were jailed. So the Espionage and Sedition Acts, persons who committed the following acts may be fined up to $10,000 in money back then, and or jailed up to 20 years. And many people were imprisoned up to 20 years. For willfully causing insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in military service. And there were other violations that you could read right there for these two acts. Under the Espionage Act, the Postmaster General, Albert S. Burleson, was given an extraordinary amount of power to basically decide what mail could go through and what could not. And the thing that he targeted a lot were left-wing, progressive, and socialist magazines, and he was able to effectively put them out of business, including the Masses, the International Socialist Review, Appeal to Reason, and the American Socialist. And a lot of these magazines were responsible for the muckraking that we talked about during the Progressive Era. And this is why, in large part, to why the Progressive Era doesn't coincidentally end in 1917. It ends mainly because of Albert S. Burslund's effective work as Postmaster General in putting out a circulation a number of magazines, right, that he felt were un-American and were impeding the war effort. Some of the results of the Espionage Acts during World War I, well, there were over 6,000 arrests. It led to the Red Scare. Reverend Clarence Waldron was arrested and convicted for telling a Bible study class that Christians could not take part in the war, and received a 15-year term. Eugene V. Debs was arrested and convicted for opposing the war and received 10 years. In prison, he gained over 1 million votes in a run for president while he was in prison. Ricardo Flores Magón, a leading Mexican-American labor organizer, was sentenced to 20 years for opposing administration's Mexico policy, which had nothing to do with the war, but might as well throw him in prison. Herbert S. Bigelow, a pacifist minister, was dragged from a stage where he was about to give a speech, taken to a wooded area by a mob, bound and gagged and whipped. This is just a testament to the war fervor that was created because, in large part, due to these espionage acts. William D. Haywood was sentenced to 20 years and $30,000 for his violation of the Espionage Act. So a guy named Charles Schneck was arrested for printing and distributing pamphlets urging citizens to oppose the draft, which he likened to slavery. For his arrest, Schneck claimed his First Amendment right was violated, and he was able to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, where he hoped he would have been able to overturn the sedition and espionage acts. Unfortunately for him, he lost. Justice Oliver Holmes, Wendell Holmes, this fellow right here, outlined the court's opinion by explaining that when a clear and present danger existed, such as shouting fire in a crowded theater, freedom of speech may be limited. And so this very famous speech here saw the arrest and undermined the arrest of thousands and thousands of individuals. Just to affirm the concern of the suspension of civil liberties and the prevalence of it, I want to play a news clip from Morning Edition on NPR that was produced, when was this produced? It was produced in 2002.
Edition from NPR News. I'm Bob Edwards. Since the terrorist attacks in September, there's been much talk about the tension between civil liberties and national security. Not a new issue. Throughout the 20th century, whenever there's a threat to American security, people, and especially immigrants, find their civil liberties squeezed. Now the question is, how long will it take for these liberties to return to normal? NPR's Barbara Bradley reports.
When you look at American history, you'll notice a recurring pattern. During times of war, the government, in the interest of homeland defense, restricts people's civil liberties in ways it doesn't dare to do during calmer times. The president's war powers increase, and the courts, which are typically the defenders of individual rights, defer to the president. Take World War I and Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs.
The handwriting is on all the billboards of the universe. The worst in socialism will be better than the best in capitalism.
During the war, Debs turned political dissent into action. He and others in his party mailed out anti-draft leaflets. Now, you'd think that leafleting would be protected by the First Amendment, but several Socialist Party members were arrested and convicted. The government claimed they violated the espionage law enacted during World War I. In 1919, the U.S. Supreme Court sided with the government in this case. In a famous opinion, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that if speech leads to, quote, a clear and present danger, if it provokes actions that could be dangerous, then the speech is not protected by the Constitution. The Supreme Court used this kind of reasoning to give the government wide latitude in exerting its emergency powers. Perhaps the most famous example of this came in response to a wave of bombings in 8 cities on June 2, 1919. Anthony Romero, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, notes that one of the blasts partially destroyed the home of the U.S. Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer.
And what ensued were a series of raids that tried to sweep up the individuals responsible for the collapsing law and order. These were known as the Palmer raids. And what we later on knew is that the 6,000 individuals who were apprehended during those raids were in fact innocent. And what came out of that process was the birth of the American Civil Liberties Union.
The founding of the ACLU in 1920 illustrates another recurring pattern. After the war threat is over, civil liberties advocates grow stronger as the president's war powers recede. Things go back to normal. According to constitutional law scholar Douglas Kamek, even Justice Holmes tried to rein in his clear and present danger standard.
And so a few years after that, Justice Holmes dissents, saying, "You misunderstood my test. You're not applying it rigorously enough. You're starting to apply it just to speech. It should only be applied to conduct that is undermining the war effort."
But the return to normal takes a long time. For example, it took the U.S. Supreme Court some 50 years to definitively change the clear and present danger standard on political speech, and it took Congress 31 years to repeal the 1917 Espionage Act. America was at peace during the 1920s and 30s, but the quiet, both for the country and for civil liberties, was cut short by the Second World War. In May 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military began moving Japanese Americans to internment camps, among them American-born Fred Korematsu. Several years ago, he recalled the experience.
You feel like a man without a country, because you're not accepted anymore. You don't know which way to turn, and so you feel that you're not worth anything.
In fact, Korematsu turned to the courts and ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court behaved as it traditionally does.
Civil liberties scholar Joan Fitzpatrick.
It deferred to the executive authority and said, "We don't know how dangerous these people are. We're not going to intrude here and order this man released and, have him go off and blow up something." They don't say that literally, but that's essentially what they're saying.
The justices ruled the president had authority to intern people of Japanese descent, even U.S. citizens. The Korematsu decision has never been overturned. Not until 1988 did a U.S. president, Ronald Reagan, apologize to the victims. It took a few more years before they received reparations. The country barely had time to reflect on the excesses of the World War II internment camps before it faced another war, this time the Cold War. And now the government had a ready tool, the Smith Act, left over from World War II.
In a series of dawn raids, FBI agents swooped down on communists indicted on charges of advocating the violent overthrow of the government.
The Smith Act allowed the government to jail anyone who advocated the overthrow of the government or joined a group that did. It was upheld by the Supreme Court, and it's still on the books. Anti-communist fervor stretched well into the 1960s, epitomized by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
The Communist Party of America is doing everything in its power to steal the minds and the souls and the hearts of our young people.
During this time, the FBI's tactics slid from legal to illegal, from overt to covert. In the so-called COINTELPRO program, FBI agents spied on those they considered suspicious. They opened mail, joined activist groups in order to disrupt them. Morton Halpern served on the National Security Council staff under both Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton.
In COINTELPRO, Hoover knew very well that what the anti-war movement was doing, what the civil rights movement was doing, was perfectly legal. And he was engaged in a deliberate effort to disrupt what he knew to be lawful political activities because he didn't like the motives and objectives of the people engaged in the activities.
It was not until the Church Committee hearings in 1975 that the public began to learn that the government was opening the mail of even prominent individuals and organizations.
As the Ford Foundation, Harvard University, the Rockefeller Foundation was...
Congressional investigations helped to restore civil liberties that had been squeezed during the Cold War. But then came September 11, 2001. the day the War on Terrorism began. In the ensuing weeks, hundreds of Muslim men were detained in the United States. Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, giving government new powers of surveillance. Morton Halperin sees parallels between the tactics used during the Cold War and those used by the FBI today.
The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover simply decided that it had the right to do what the government in a different way has decided it now has the right to do post-September 11th, that is to engage in activities which are designed to disrupt conduct because it does not have sufficient evidence to arrest people.
Douglas Kamek agrees there are echoes with the war against communism.
But there's a fundamental difference, too. Whatever we feared about communism, it never manifested itself. Everybody saw September 11th. That is a much more dramatic and persuasive case to be made for a curtailment of civil liberty than communism ever was, or ever could hope to be.
And the war on terrorism is different in another way, says Joan Fitzpatrick. It's open-ended.
The advantage of a declared war is you know who the enemy is. So you know whom to negotiate a peace with. When you've got the war on terrorism, there's so many different actors. It's extremely difficult to decide that it's all over. And in fact, even if a particular terrorist organization is dismantled, something else is going to pop up somewhere else.
In which case, there's no way to know when life and the freedoms Americans have grown so used to will return to normal. Barbara Bradley, NPR News, Washington.